In this video, we're going to implement search functionality in React Server Components in Next.js 13 app router. We're going to build on top of the application we created in the previous video where we looked at pagination in Server Components. We were fetching some movies from our MongoDB database, and we had this next and previous buttons to kind of change and navigate between different pages of our application. Now, if you haven't seen that video, I'm going to include a link in the card so you can watch that first and see how we get to where we are here. And in this video, we're going to implement this search functionality where the user can just search for a specific movie by the title. They can still paginate through the list with that search term, or they can just use that search term to maybe search for a specific cast member in a movie. All with setting URL parameters as a way to kind of hold this state or this client-side interactivity and communicate that back to our server. So let's jump into the code and see how we're implementing this together. Now, where we left off in the previous video was implementing this page component, which was inside of our movies that's responsible for rendering our movies page. We were getting a list of our movies by calling this getMovies function. This was a function we implemented inside of our library. So inside of our lib in MongoDB, we had a client.ts. This is where we created a connection to our MongoDB database by providing our MongoDB URI as a connection string as a local environment variable. And then we had this movies file where we kind of encapsulated all the functions that relate to our movies collection. We created this getMovies function where it was just performing a find query on the movies collection to find some movies, limit them based on the limit that we're passing into this function, if there is any, or defaulting to only 10 movies, as you can see here. And then also skipping a specific number of pages depending on the page parameter that we're passing into this getMovie. So all in all, what we were doing here is to reading these page and limit parameters from search params. This is an object that's passed to your page components by Next.js that holds your query strings or your URL search parameters. And we were just passing that down to this getMovies function to get the movies and then render them down here. Now for the next and previous buttons, we're just using links that would just push the user to a new link and set the page to the next page or to the previous page, depending on whether you push the previous button or the next button. Now to implement the search functionality, let's actually create a component maybe called search. So I'm going to create a new component called search. And then here, what we're going to do is to return a component. And let me just copy some code for the JSX or for the actual search input. And then I'm going to also have to install hero icons. I'm using hero icons for my magnifying glass in the search input. So let's just get this package installed. Let me just pm add -d and then hero icons react. Okay, let me just restart the dev server. So here I am just rendering an input and I'm holding a local state to read the value and then change that state based on the unchanged. So let's actually also bring in our React use-state hook to set this text. And let's start from an empty string. We can also import this from React. We are using hooks, so we have to turn this into a client component. Let me just add the use client directive up top and save this. Sorry, I just typed in texts here. So this should now work. Let me just go back to my page component and create a div and bring in this search component that we created together. Let's go back to our page. And now here, if I refresh, I should be able to see my search input. Okay, great. So we have this search input set over here where we can pass in some values, and we're actually holding this locally in a React state. Let's now create an effect here where we can just log anytime that this text changes, we're going to just console log this text just to test everything out. If I open up my console over here, let me just make this bigger. If I refresh and also refresh that, if I put in any text here, we can see it's being logged over here. Okay, so we now have access to what the user is trying to search inside of this client component. But how can we send the search term back to our page component where we're actually fetching our movies? Now we're going to implement or use a similar concept as what we used to kind of communicate these different pages to our server, which was through URL or URL search parameters. Now, not only you can use a URL to hold this state of what page or how many limits of documents you want to return or what search term or query the user is trying to search for. You can also expand on it if you want to implement more filters here for the search functionality. You could just hold them up in the URL as a place to hold a state, but also as a way to communicate user interaction from client component back to your server component or to your server where you're actually doing your data fetching. So to do this, let's actually go ahead and inside of this use effect, use the router. So let me just get the router from use router hook that we can get from Next Navigation. Just keep in mind that the router that we want to use inside of our app router comes from Next Navigation and not the Next router. The Next router still works, but it is for the pages router. If you need to use this use router hook inside of the app directory, you need to import it from Next Navigation. So with the use of this router here, maybe we can say anytime that this text changes or this search input changes, we're going to actually push the user to movies, and then we're going to pass a search parameter and we're going to just set it to this text. Okay, and I guess this also needs to have the router to stop screaming at me. So if I now go back to our application and start typing inside this search box, you can see we are now setting that URL search parameters up top, which is going to communicate to our page component. And then we can read this new search parameters and then pass it down here in getMovies. But before we do that, one thing I want to implement here is that instead of just setting or changing the URL on every keystroke, I want to debounce the user input. So once they're done typing in, then I want to change the URL. Because if we're doing this on every single keystroke, we're actually literally hammering our server or querying our database on every single keystroke. And that's not a good user experience or a technical way of implementing or working with user inputs. We want to be able to debounce it. So they might be starting typing in. You can just delay that for 500 milliseconds or 750 milliseconds. And then once they're done, you're going to get the term and then actually push them to that URL. Now to do that, we're going to use a package called Debounce. We can search for use-debounce. This is a React hook, which is going to allow you to debounce a value. So let me just go ahead and install this. Let me just stop the dev server. I'm going to go pm add use-debounce. I actually have a video on the channel where I talk about this in more details. I'm going to also link it somewhere in the cart if you're interested to learn more about this. But it's pretty easy to implement. So all we need to do here is to create a debounced value. Let's call it debounced. And we're going to use debounce. And this takes in a value and the amount of time that you want to actually debounce this. So I'm going to pass in this text state, which is what the user is trying to actually search. And then I'm going to delay that or debounce that for 500 seconds. Let's actually name this query so it makes more sense. Now down here, I actually want to use this query. So I'm going to use the debounced value instead of the text. So anytime that the query changes this time, now I want to pass that to the URL. Now going back to our application to test this out, let me just also close this. If I now start typing inside this search box, as you can see, it's going to take some time before it actually hits the URL, which is going to send a request or communicate this to our server component to fetch relevant movies. Now, if I also try to delete this search term, you can see it again takes in some time for me to finish typing, and then clears out that search parameter. Now, right now, it just passing nothing to our search parameter. So what we can do instead of our use effect is maybe to actually see if the query is a truthy value, and then set this search parameter. And if it's not, we're going to actually push them back to the movies page where we don't have any search parameter. So if I now save this, it should send us back to the movies page, as you can see there. So if I search again for our movie title, it's going to take some time, pass in that search. And then if I go ahead and delete this, it's going to take us back to the movies page without any search parameters set. Now, let's go back to the page component and actually read this value that we're passing in here. So similar to what we have done with the limit and page that we read from our search parameters, I'm going to read the search. If it's a string, I'm going to actually use it, otherwise undefined. And what we can do here is to actually pass in a query to our function that we have defined before and set this to this search term that we are getting from our URL search parameter. So it's a bit small here. So we're reading this search string from our search params object that's passed into our page component, and we're just passing it to our getMovies function as a query. So let's go back to our movies collection and actually implement this search. Let me just copy some code over here so you don't have to watch me type. Okay, let me explain what I've added to this getMovies function here. On top of the page and the limit parameters we were passing it before, I'm also expecting this query. This is the search term coming in from the client side, so we can use it inside of our query to return relevant movies. It's not defaulting to any value because the user can be on the first page just trying to paginate without actually searching for any specific term. So there's no default value here. That's why it's also marked as optional inside of this type. Now we're still doing the pagination with this skip variable we're creating here, but instead of performing a find query on our collection, I'm actually using MongoDB aggregation pipelines to perform a full text search using this search stage. Now this will allow you to do a full text search using some fuzzy matching on any field that you want. In this case, I am providing a wildcard character for my path, which means that whatever search term that they pass in can be used to match against any field inside of my document or record. For example, it can be inside of the title of the movie, it can be inside of the cast, it can be inside of the full plot and whatnot. You can also pass in a specific path. For example, if you want to only search within the title, you can pass in the title here. Now, the implementation detail of this search pipeline is a bit beyond the scope of this video, but I'm going to include a link in the description if you're interested to learn more about this pipeline or about this aggregation feature in MongoDB. But from a high level, what we're doing here is we're creating this pipeline. These are different queries you run against your database. In here, I have a stage for skipping a specific amount of documents and also this limit. And I'm also checking to see if I do have a query. So if we are passing in a query, I'm actually adding this stage to my pipeline, which is just going to use this search stage to run that query against all of the fields with some fuzzy matching and then return some results, which we are just getting in here and returning back to our page component. So now that we have implemented this, if I go back to the application and start searching for a specific topic, this is going to set a search parameter. This is going to send that URL to our server component, which is going to perform this query to fetch a specific term inside of our database, for example, for a specific title or even a specific cast, because I'm using this wildcard character for my path, which just searches for that term against all the fields inside of our documents in our movies collection. But now there's a couple of problems in our app. First of all, if I now try to paginate, if I click on this next button, it actually wipes our search term out because it's just pushing the user to this URL. So what we need to do here, going back to our page where we're actually setting in or using these links as our buttons, I'm going to actually use a different way to set up the href for our links over here. So if you look at the documentation for Next.js, there's two ways you can pass in an href to your link component. One is the way that we have already done is just passing it a string. The other way is to just pass it an object where you can define a path name and then your query parameters. And the reason why I'm doing this is I want to look to see if I do actually have a search set on the URL already. And if I do, I want to actually also use that together with the page and actually kind of sending them to the previous page or to the next page. So I'm going to also do this for the next button down here. So instead of passing in a string that doesn't take our search into account, I'm just using a URL, which makes it easier to also read both. And if there's a search, to read that or to set that as well, or to keep it there while we're actually changing the page. Now with this, if I refresh the page, if I now search for, let's say, Bruce Lee, I'm going to see that search term kicking in. And if I click next, not only I have that search term set, but I'm also going to the next page, which still is taking this search term into account. Let's search for something else. Now, as you can see, I spelled this wrong, but the fuzzy match, it's actually bringing all the Rocky movies up, and I can also go to the next page. Okay, now that works, but we still have another problem. If I now refresh this page, you can see this search term is wiped out. And then after the debounce kicks in, setting our query to an empty string, our use effect is actually pushing the user back to the movies page. So if you go to the search component, what happens is that once I refresh the page, this state went back to being an empty string, even though we had the search term up in the URL. And then this use-debounce kicked into place after 500 milliseconds, setting this query. The query actually changed. This runs, and because there is no query term, it's going to actually push the user to this movies. Now, the first thing we need to do is to actually set or pass in the search parameter that's in the URL to this search component, so we can initialize this state with that term and then set it down here on the input. So if the page is refreshed, it is not going to actually wipe the search term off of the search input box. So let's just go back to our page component where we are rendering this search. We can pass in this search parameter that we got off the URL as a prop to this component, so we can initialize our state with it. So let me just pass in this search. Now inside of our search component, I can expect to receive this search prop, which is going to be search. Let me just type this out. It's going to be a string, and it maybe even optional because maybe they don't send any search. And then we can use this search to initialize our state, which is then this text state, which is the value of our input. If I now search for a term, let's say I also go to the second page. If I now refresh the page, something else actually happens. As you can see up top, it just wiped the page out and brought us back to the first page when we refresh the page. This is also going to happen if you copy this link somewhere else. And the reason why that's happening is that now that we are actually reading this initial value or passing this search term from the URL as a prop to this search component to set inside of this search input, what happens after this use effect runs, because now the query has a value, it actually goes ahead and pushes the user to this movies/search, which doesn't have the page inside of it. So if this is only on this search term without any page parameter set and you refresh it, it works because it passes this search parameter that exists on the URL to this page component. And if you copy this into a new page, as I can show you here, it's just going to land on that same page because this is persisted here and also down here. But the problem is if we go ahead and have a pagination value up top in the URL as well, And now if we refresh the page, what happens is this kicks in inside of our use effect, redirects the user back to search that query, so it disregards that page that existed there. So to bypass this problem, we can actually use ref to disable the use effect from running on the initial render. So I'm going to create a initial render ref. I'm going to use the use ref hook from React, and I'm going to initialize this to true. And then inside of our use effect, I'm going to check to see if this is our initial or first render by checking the initial render.current coming from this use ref. And if it is our first render, I'm going to return, effectively disabling this effect to kick in, so we're not actually using that page parameter that existed there. So if I now save in here and actually go ahead to the second page, let me also refresh this page. Now if I go ahead and click to go to the next page, we can still see the second page, also our search term. And if I now refresh this, because we are not going to run this effect on the first render, it is going to keep that state for our search term and also our second page there. And from this point on, if you go forward or you go backward, it still works. You can just copy this link and the other user would end up at the same page with the same search term, with the same pagination or page number as where you copied this. Now this is the benefit of using the URL as a state. Not only you can share it, but also there is a history track inside of your browser, so you can use the back and forward buttons now to just go or move in the history stack of the browser for different states of your application for different movies that you have here. That's a wrap for this video, folks. We implemented server-side search functionality by linking client-side interaction to our server components through the URL. This not only allowed us to hold some state up in the URL for our search and pagination, but also communicate that to our server components where we're actually fetching data. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. If you want to see more content specific to MongoDB, please let me know in the comments below. Maybe I create a specific full text search video for MongoDB where we can add in more filters or facet search inside of our application using aggregation pipelines in MongoDB. If you're interested in learning NextJs, I do have a course. There's a link in the description. Let me know if you have any questions, and until next one, bye-bye.